Apex Express, Asian Pacific Expression.
Community and cultural coverage.
Music and calendar.
New visions and voices.
Coming to you with an Asian Pacific Islander point of view.
It's time to get on board the Apex Express.
Good evening. You're tuned to Apex Express. News and views with an API point of view. On tonight's show, we talk with Hiroshi Fukurai, a professor at UC Santa Cruz. He was born in Sendai, the epicenter of last month's monstrous 9.0 earthquake, and his family still lives in the region. He talks with us about the nuclear power system in Japan, the Tokyo Electric Power Company's heavy hand on the media, and Japan's recent passage of an Internet Surveillance Act.
Next, we will talk to Haruki Ida from the Japan Multicultural Relief Fund. The fund is dedicated to providing aid to the earthquake victims in Japan with special attention to ethnic minorities.
For National Poetry Month, we welcome poet and MC Colin Masashi Ehara, aka Sendai.
And finally, Jason Zhang talks with us about We Are One Island, a Japan relief concert and auction taking place at the Oakland Asian Cultural Center this Saturday. And we are your hosts, Robin and Miriam, so keep it locked here on Apex Express.
Hiroshi Fukurai is a professor of legal studies and sociology at UC Santa Cruz. His focus is on the jury system, international law, and global justice. He was born in Sendai, and the tsunami stopped just east of his father's house, but he lost 4 cousins in the disaster. Professor Fukurai has been sending potassium iodide tablets, which are out of stock in Japan, and Geiger counters to his family members to measure the radiation effects in the region. With the level of the nuclear accident being elevated to 7 and no end in sight, his brother-in-law sent 2 nieces to stay with him in the U.S. But aside from his personal story, Professor Fukurai has a much more dramatic story to tell about the Japanese government and the nuclear power industry in Japan. You've been critical of Japan's nuclear policies. If we could start with TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, and how they responded immediately after the tsunami struck. Some people have said that they should have evacuated a wider radius sooner, and that those who were told to shelter in place were left abandoned without food, water, or a way to later evacuate. So how do you think TEPCO handled their response within the first couple of weeks?
What they should have done, along with the Japanese government, is exactly what the U.S. government has done in Japan. U.S. Embassy has issued a warning of any Americans living within the 50-mile radius from the nuclear reactor and the plant. Evacuate outside. They also have transferred the headquarters of U.S. Embassy from Tokyo to Osaka.
Further south?
Further south. Mm-hmm. And they also implemented the programs for anyone who show up at the embassy with the U.S. passport. They handed out at least 7 tablets of the potassium iodide, so protect themselves from the radiations. And none of those programs being instituted in Japan.
Why do you think they have been less conservative with their response?
Well, if you look at anything about the nature or characteristics of the Japanese corporations as well as Japanese government, they have been always secretive and try to put all those inconvenient information under the rug from the views and then from the ears of the public. For example, TEPCO has been accused of falsifying data of the inspections in the past. It got so much publicity to the extent that the 2002, the TEPCO president, TEPCO means Tokyo Electric Power Company, the president was forced to resign. And they have been accused of professional negligence in causing death and injury of its own workers. Even up to 2 weeks before the earthquake, TEPCO finally admitted that they failed to do some inspections of 32 pieces of equipment in the cooling system. That's exactly the system that really, they said, failed by tsunami and earthquake. So TEPCO has had a long history of those professional negligence, and everybody knew about it, but nonetheless, government allowed this company to operate one of the most sensitive and sophisticated machinery that human has ever invented.
Well, and as the saga continues, we've slowly been becoming aware of the workers in these power plants. Initially there was talk about the Fukushima 50, the folks who were trying to mitigate the disaster. And then now the term nuclear gypsies has arisen. So can you talk about who these folks are and how they are part of this bifurcated labor system?
Well, the most recent study has indicated that 89% of the workers in the nuclear industry are so-called subcontract workers, and they are actually recruited from the slums of Tokyo and Osaka areas. Many people are members of racial and ethnic minorities, and there are lots of Brahmins, and those are historically discriminated groups, and Koreans and people in lower class. Even the homeless people are being recruited to work in those firms.
I think that there was an article, I forgot where I saw it, but it was talking about that some of those Fukushima 50 are they're not experts in the nuclear field. They're people with a hammer or janitors who are being called in to try to deal with this disaster. And I think that there was also information out there saying that when you talk about the 10% of the full-time workers, they're trained in safety precautions, and that these subcontractors have less training in safety. They have some of the more dangerous and toxic jobs, right?
It's very ironic. Those individuals are being discriminated by the Japanese societies are exactly the kinds of people who try to preserve the safety of the Japanese society, which continue to discriminate.
Right. Well, I did hear that residents living near the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power facility gathered in protest at TEPCO's Tokyo headquarters on April 13th to demand immediate compensation for their displacement of home and livelihood. Here in the West, we've mostly seen media reports about Japanese people who have been so well behaved through the crisis. So what does this kind of protest signify, and what kind of effect do you think it will have?
Well, the problem is not the extent of protest. It's been there always, but the media did not really focus on those people. Because, if you look at how powerful TEPCO is, the power company is, it's tremendous because they actually control the mass media through either, the sponsorship of programs or the investment in those firms. So it's very difficult for the Japanese people to know exactly the extent of protest against not only TEPCO, but nuclear programs of Japanese government. Just 2 months ago, there had been the letter being written by many of the anti-nuclear grassroots organizations, including Greenpeace in Japan, protesting the recommissioning of the Mark 1, Unit 1, that's the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, which was supposed to be decommissioned 3 months ago as being the oldest nuclear reactor in the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. And after 40 years, and it was to be decommissioned, but Japanese Atomic Energy Commission has agreed to recommission and continue the operation. Those grassroots organizations submitted and sent a very strong letter of protest against the TEPCO CEOs, but they haven't heard anything in response. And that was not picked up by any of the major media.
What's happening now does create a window of opportunity then, because there is coverage about the anti-nuclear movement. The Washington Post featured photographer Kenji Higuchi, he was publishing some of the first images of nuclear workers toiling inside a reactor back in 1977, and now his message is getting out there. So what do you see as the opportunities right now?
One thing that people need to realize is the fact that how Japanese government control the media. And just 3 days ago, the Japanese cabinet has passed the so-called Internet Surveillance Act. And that means anybody who put on, say, anti-government policy blogs or messages, the Japanese government no longer needs the warrant, but has the authority to ask the internet providers to provide information of those people who put on those anti-government or anti-nuclear messages. So it's going to be very difficult, even in near future, to use the internet space to promote and continuously facilitate this anti-nuclear programs and anti-nuclear development.
In closing, what are the other options then?
Well, it's very difficult.
Right.
I mean, if I have the solution, I'm sure that it's being out there already. Even though there is a green revolution, so to speak, is taking place. The biggest use of those non-renewable fuels are militaries. It's very difficult to imagine that battleships run on solar energy, for example, or the tanks running on wind powers. This is a great chance to rethink about the continuous search for the energy resources to feed our ways of civilization. It could be a moment in which that we really collectively must think about the ways to create the sustainable society, energy sovereign, food sovereign, and so on.
Well, amen. Thank you so much, Professor Hiroshi Fukurai, for taking time to talk with us on Apex Express.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
You're listening to Apex Express on KPFA 94.1 FM. That was Professor Hiroshi Fukurai. Now, Robin, you joked about having to kill the babies on this piece. And what exactly does that mean? Because sounds kind of scary.
Well, it's like when you're really attached to like a part of a piece or a segment from a piece that you don't want to let go, but sometimes you just gotta kill the babies for the sake of the piece. So a couple of things that I wanted to just mention that he had talked about was that Professor Fukurai's wife, he works as a broadcast reporter and anchor in Japan. And so a group of people at the station wanted to do an investigation on safety at nuclear power plants.
Okay.
But then the director from the Division of Sales came over and said, please do not have any programs that could even look at the nuclear program from a critical perspective.
Wow.
So that was just like one example of what a heavy hand TEPCO has in the media. And then also I had to cut out a part where the professor was talking about the fact that GE provided the blueprint for the design of all 6 reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi plant. And that design had been criticized by GE scientists back in 1976. They were whistleblowers, and they were immediately fired.
Wow.
And when I asked him what the criticism was, he said that it was a structural design flaw that had to do with the placement of the containment of the spent fuel rods. It's located on an upper level, and that's what the problem is. You can't keep they're not able to keep the spent fuel rods cool enough.
Okay.
But because they're elevated, they're that much closer to the roof, and it's impossible to keep them submerged in cooling water.
Oh, wow.
And so this very criticism that happened back in the 70s, that was a design by GE is what's causing the disaster right now.
And it was never given any attention back then.
No.
Wow. Well, I guess that brings us to the next part. The nuclear gypsies that Professor Fukurai referenced are comprised largely of ethnic minorities in Japan. And I had a chance to speak with Haruki Ira of the Japanese Multicultural Relief Fund to learn about how the disasters have been especially challenging for minorities in Japan.